Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hermann Pretorius. I'm the Deputy Head of Policy Research for the Institute of Race Relations. And today we have our Senekal debrief conversation. And I can see that Big Daddy Liberty might need more than a debrief. He might, need some form of freezer, but we'll get to him. He is by nature a cool cat. I'm joined here by three of my colleagues, and all four of us happened to be in Senekal last Friday when, things went down or did not go down. It depends on who you talk to, and we will definitely discuss that today. So let me introduce perhaps the most unknown face to our audience here, and that is Mr. Alex Weiss, who is in my screen, top left-hand corner. Alex is our social media campaigns guru and officer, making sure that everything runs smoothly behind the scenes. And he is also responsible for herding 3 cats here today to make sure that we can have, the gift of the gab, Big Daddy Liberty, and myself here talking about our diverse experiences. And Alex, however, not simply, he's not just a pretty face in the sense that he's behind us, making sure everything goes well. He also was on the job and has some glorious insights. I think he could be a useful voice to have. He flitted kind of between the several stations. So Alex, thank you very much for peering from behind the camera for once. It's good to have you here. Then we have directly below me, I think, at least on my screen, is Gabriel Crouse. Of course, just all-round reporter, thinker, cricket in a thorn bush, who you all will be very familiar with. And then to the bottom left is Big Daddy Liberty, Sihle Ngubese himself, joining us hopefully from his Liberty vehicle somewhere in Johannesburg, I think. But perhaps let's get started, and hopefully Big Daddy Liberty can join us. He seems to have frozen a bit, but I'm sure we'll try to figure that out. So, Gabriel, I think perhaps let's start with you. Chronology, context. Why were we there? Why was the IRR in Senekal last Friday?
So, former President Kgalema Motlanthe said that if things don't go right in Senekal, it could be the start of a kind of civil war. And I think that appraisal was correct in the respect that there was a worst case scenario where there would be blood on the streets. There were anti-farm murder protesters who had convened on Senekal, hundreds, 600 to 800, and from what we saw on the ground, their general message was to seek peace. But the weekend before, some protesters had descended upon the magistrate's court and, amongst other things, scrummed an inyala, and which is an impressive sight to see. I spoke to a journalist who saw that herself, and also set fire to a police van. So there was worries that that kind of destructive behavior would be met with more destructive behavior from the EFF side, and that the police wouldn't be able to maintain command and control. And people shooting each other, stabbing each other, with the cameras of the country and of the world watching it, I think would drive a race-baiting, divisive spoke right into the heart of this country. Senekal is very centrally placed right in the middle. And I think it became a very central story. So we went there to cover it, to seek truth from facts, to see what the demands were, to see why people came, to see what the leadership said, of course, as well. And let's not forget the cause d'etre, the cause of the heart of this whole issue is the murder of Brendan Horner, a farm worker near Paul Roux, very close to Senekal, who on the 1st of October was stabbed several times in his neck and his arms and his legs, dragged, injury to his thigh, and then strangled to death. And the sort of nominal reason that people were coming was that there was the bail hearing for 2 of the accused. two people accused of being complicit in this murder. And as we saw in the magistrate's court, there was a witness who came to say that these two accused had bragged after the fact about having killed a white farm worker. And so that's part of the prima facie evidence that I suppose we went there to see.
I mean, that's tough to listen to, I must say, sitting here. I mean, it's the upteenth time that we've spoken about this, but still, it doesn't get easier, and I think it reflects. I think this is where President Ramaphosa got something right in his statement that all rational South Africans and all right-minded South Africans share a horror as to the murder of Brendan Horner. And perhaps, Sihle, I can come to you. You bring a very unique perspective, being an aspirant farmer, partly in your life, in addition to being an advocate for liberty, having spent a lot of time, especially over the last few months, engaging with people on farm murders, going into Senekal. Why do you think it was necessary for Big Daddy Liberty to be
there? I think there's far too many. I think the first impulse is that there's far too many voices on both the extreme left in this country and the extreme right who seek to jump on to issues like these, and in a manner which is reminiscent of just, unashamed grifting, will appropriate the pain of communities around this country, will basically try and position themselves politically on these issues, but offer no solutions which are actually workable, which actually improve the quality of lives of the people who they affect to trade for, the people they claim to represent. So on that basis, it was an impulse in me to just head over to Senekal to be a part of the growing, and thankfully they're growing, moderate voices in this country. People who are dead set on building that non-racial, that property owning, that free society, a society that therefore, on that basis, addresses issues that we all face as South Africans. The lack of safety in rural areas is an issue we all face as South Africans, because even if you live in an urban area, you can identify with that palpable sense of danger that crime in this country presents. So it was important, therefore, for, I think, moderate voices, and I would really believe that I am part of that league of moderate voices, to show up in these spaces and to create even more distance between those ordinary South Africans looking to live in a society which is non-racial, as I said, which is prosperous, property owning and free, to create more distance between that type of South African and the type of South African who wants to mobilize society either from the perspective of being on the extreme left or right, based on race and other really arbitrary and useless things, to be honest. So it was a good exercise in that regard, and I think the mission I gave myself was somewhat achieved, because I also was able to bring, of course, in footage, images of those very stark differences between the ordinary South African versus the extreme left, in this case the EFF, and really the extreme right, of those few voices that were there in Senekal.
Alex, speaking about gaining footage, that's a very big part of your role here at the Institute, where you've gone out, we shot a documentary together. Oh, actually, everyone here was involved in that, about lifting the lethal lockdown. And part of, I think, what at least guides me in my thinking is the good old Helen Suzman quote is, go see for yourself. So from a perspective of capturing footage of the day, what footage sticks in your mind that best contextualizes the importance of the Senekal events?
Sure. Well, I think for me, Herman, you were stationed at the sort of AfriForum gathering sort of one of the sort of farmer representative groups that were there. And it was a little bit further outside of town. I started obviously with Gabriel, and we headed to the courts, which is obviously very exciting. You've got media there and stacks of police and vans and barbed wire and lots of singing and dancing. And I think for me, the most interesting thing is that the event that AfriForum hosted was very organized. It was very somber. There were a lot of speeches, a lot of sincere, a lot of sincere reflection, I think, is the how I would encapsulate it. And there was a dominee who said some prayers. I think the Lord's Prayer was sung towards the end. So very, very calm. And the one thing that stood out to me was shooting with the camera. So shots of farmers literally on their knees, bowing their heads, hats off, contrasted to the events that were happening in town, which just seemed completely detached from what the sort of other groups were doing. So to go from watching guys bowing their heads and saying prayers to sort of protests in the streets, which one couldn't really gauge were about off the cuff, and sort of some EFF protesters burning ANC T-shirts, for example, was quite a stark contrast. So I think that very much stood out to me for sure.
One thing that I kind of take away as actually a great victory from Friday's events is that the people who were, let's call it, organically involved in the events, the community, the farmers, the people who were at the event, not because they were bussed in, but because they felt that they had an investment in the day. Those people from all sides, whether they were locals of Senekal, whether they were farmers from Natal or Cape Town, that's where you found, I think, that somberness, that honesty, that integrity, Alex, that you speak of. It is, to my mind, a bit of a positive sign that the antagonism and the anger had to, in a way, be manufactured, be imported into a society that was reeling from this horrible event merely 2-3 weeks prior. So the fact that the society itself didn't fracture into antagonism, but that any antagonism that was there almost had to be bussed in, had to be created. To my mind, that's a very solid reflection of what IRR data has been showing for many years, is that South Africans are decent, middle of the road, moderates, conservatives with a small c, who want to live in a prosperous and peaceful country. Gabriel, do you think that the geographical layout of the day told us anything about the tensions of the day, and whether this importation of anger really was a bona fide attempt to air grievances, or perhaps political theatre in a more cynical sense?
Yeah, I mean, looking at the geography of the day, it was dictated by the police, who I think did a very good job of setting up blockades to make sure that people weren't bringing in firearms from the day before. Of course, in the car Alex and I were in, the police thoroughly searched our boot but didn't search our back seat at all. So, I think people could have brought in firearms if they really wanted to, but it created this impression that there oughtn't to be any guns here. And so if shots had been fired from either side, you'd know where it was, and that side had acted in bad faith. So that was good. And then demarcating the EFF over here, close to the church, the ANC Youth League on the other side of the church. I think maybe someone was having a laugh when they put the EFF on Jan van Riebeck Street. Certainly Floyd Shivambu and Julius Malema made a big issue out of that. And then the anti-farm motor protesters 4-5 blocks away, so that there was this large buffer zone sort of on the edge of Senekal's central town. And then beyond that, another group of farmers gathered up, sort of small informal group. And then beyond that, the AfriForum tent. Geographically, I think it's interesting that the AfriForum tent was set up so far away. I think they were trying very hard to be present without in any way seeming confrontational or provocative. Maybe some wisdom to that. I think it's worth noting. I saw two in the farmer grouping that was just outside of town, but not quite inside of town. The second grouping, I saw two sets of speeches where people were calling to go into Senekal, to get in the face of the EFF, and there was something very interesting about that because I saw black preachers and white preachers get up and lead from the back of a bakkie the 200 odd people that are around there in prayer. And I also saw over there people get down on their knees and sing the Lord's Prayer, and it was moving. But then I saw two people get up and say, we're not close enough. We're not sending a strong enough message that we're not afraid. We need to go get there and show the EFF who we are. And ironically, one of these people was colored and one of these people was black. And I think there's an important message for non-racialists there. We at the Institute of Race Relations are, without question, the longest serving body to preserve the values of non-racialism in this country. And so we hold it very dear to our hearts and foremost in our minds. But it's not the only value that there is. It's not good enough to be a non-racialist if you're a violent, aggressive, provocative non-racialist who's going out there trying to cause trouble rather than trying to bring cool heads and to ensure peace. I mean, this is not to say self-defense and all of that. That's another issue. I'm saying going out there and pushing into the town. I think that the people who did cheer in the crowd when those agents provocateurs got up there and said, let's go get going, I think part of what excited them was, and part of this was said in the speeches, look, this is not black and white. I'm a colored guy, I'm a black guy. We all need to go stop the EFF. So they were punting non-racialism, and that's great. But at the same time, they were punting aggression. And I think in a reckless way. And what's important about that is that it was the command and control, is that those people who came there to cause trouble, they were controlled. And in part, they were controlled by the police. In part, they were controlled by fears about what the EFF might do in reprisal. But I think the primary sense, they were controlled by their own group, by their own leaders. And Alex and I we all went to a bar in Paul Rue after the sort of main protest for lunch. And we sat there, and it was, mixed race bar, people were hanging out. And I spoke to some Paul Rue locals next to me, and they were sort of very glad that there'd been no violence, very irritated, just contemplating the murder of Brendan Horner and the potential complicity of the police in a stock theft syndicate that might have been involved, but glad that peace had been maintained. And then came along just before we left, two people to the bar to complain. Oh, we came to see some action, to punch some guys in the face, to really get in the face of the EFF, and they felt robbed of that opportunity to do violence. And I think that's very telling. The fact that there were people who wanted to go there to draw blood were denied of that opportunity. I think that shows that it can be done. And I've got to say, it's the same on the EFF side. Malema, he said we came here to fight and die for the land. He had supporters chanting "kill the Boer." It couldn't be more incendiary. It couldn't be more revolting in a sense. There in front of a court, trying people for a farm murder. He says there are no such thing as white farmers being killed in South Africa. I mean, when Ramaphosa said it, at least he was in New York. Malema was saying it right outside the courthouse. It's crazy. And it's unacceptable language. But at the same time, he called for discipline. So did Floyd Shivambu, and the marshals on the ground enforced that discipline. And I suppose I'm dragging on here, but anecdotally, I've felt this myself. After Alex left to go and film Hermann, and while Sihle was on the other side speaking to people, I got caught in a little street that was sort of blocked off on both ends, and I saw a bunch of EFF supporters who'd left the main stage because Malema had gone into court. And there were about 100 of them, and I started with a few, trying to ask questions, just asking. I wanted to file my report because I thought it's looking good so far. And I wanted to get a quote from an EFF supporter to see how their day's going. So I just asked, how's your day going? And a few said, go speak to them instead, until I was kind of drawn into the crowd, almost into the middle of the crowd. then I said, how's your day going? And they said, why are you talking to us? Go talk to your own people. Who are my people? White people. Go there. You don't belong with us. We don't want you here. You're not welcome here. And some of the guys, I didn't take a step backwards. I kept my friendly face on because I wanted to get information. And some people were sort of ready to laugh on a joke with me about how hot the day is. But some characters emerged from the crowd that looked bloodshot eyes, skinny, broken shoes. They looked like they were having a tough time of it, and they wanted to teach me a lesson. And I reflected in a moment upon the fact that if they did take me off my feet, there'd be nothing to stop them. It was me against 80 people, if it goes that way, and no police in sight because I was in the sort of dead zone buffer part that was off the main road. And who came in to stop the violence? It was EFF marshals. And the same thing happened they're wearing nice new leather shoes and new leather jackets, and they've got smartphones. They're definitely coming from a different place. And the same was true on the main scuffle outside the Wimpy. Police didn't really do everything. I mean, they set up the preconditions to keep give peace the best chance. But when there was scuffles, they didn't physically intervene in any of the ones that I actually know about. But EFF marshals did, as did anti-farm murder protesters. Kind of people pulled each other back from their own side. And I think it's a very important message to recognize that EFF supporters do actually, to some extent, obey their commander-in-chief. And when he says attack, then you have petrol bombs being thrown into places of medicine. You have other ones being burnt down. You've got old ladies getting muscled over and sent to hospital. And when he says, we won't throw the first punch, then, you see some thrown bottles, you see some kill the boer, you see some zap signs thrown out of the bus. But ultimately, you also see those marshals holding the forces back. And I think if you want to hold the leadership accountable when things go wrong, which they have, this is not imaginary, then you must also give them credit for when things go right and hold them to that standard, because there will be another thing like this. I mean, this trial's not even over, and farm murders are not over. So I think we must remember this and hold them to this standard at the very least. At the very least.
Sihle, you spent some time deliberately with the EFF side, seeking to honestly suss out with the arguments for the EFF being there. And you, of course, have a proper history of more than a year of going to these EFF events, asking these EFF attendees questions about their motivations, about the fragility of election manifestos, and so on. So from that perspective, what did you pick up about the EFF attendees, and do you think that what you picked up perhaps was antagonistic in a way that it challenges the conclusions that the IRR has come to, that South Africans are moderate, decent, middle of the road people? Or do you think that there is something dangerous and radical that you picked up?
Yeah, I think the biggest indictment on the EFF on that day was that the vast majority of people who were there, who were red-clad, who were EFF members, were not actually from that area, or even its most immediate surrounding areas, which are mostly very rural parts of the country. The vast majority of people I spoke to, indicated that, look, we were bussed in from, sort of the more major urban centers, Bloemfontein being the predominant one. Some coming as far as even Eldorado Park, which should give you an indication of just how, if you were to juxtapose the rhetoric versus what is, you would assume that the EFF is the sort of party that can mobilize massive numbers in rural parts of the country, especially given their messaging, right, which is supposedly pro the rural person, of, for example, expropriation without compensation, the inflammatory rhetoric of taking from white farmers to give to the black farm worker. You therefore expect that, hey, the largest numbers of people who would swell the ranks of the EFF would be people from that area, but that just wasn't the case, number one. And if anything, you had cases of, and we caught this in the recording, of local residents almost standing to the side as spectators of what was happening in front of them. You know, both the that small contingent, it really was a fraction of what I'll call the ultra-right farmers, who themselves even, you know, placed clear blue water, excuse the pun, between themselves and ordinary farming members in that area. You could almost see the difference between them and ordinary members of the community. And of course, the radical left who were there. And in both instances, ordinary residents were just sort of like sitting at the side, looking at this as spectators. It was that which I found as to be the first observation on the day, which really put paid this idea that the EFF has a mass following amongst poor rural folk. I think it's mostly urban, and yes, it is poor, but it's mostly urban. And it is when you talk to those voters then, or those EFF members, which is what I then did on the day, and you interrogate their arguments, you interrogate the talking points, which are often they parrot from their leadership, you quickly see that these people don't really buy into this. It's more just talking points which edify a particular prejudice. And when you bust the prejudice, when you show them that the very foundation of the prejudice itself is nonsensical, then the rhetoric disappears, and suddenly they start agreeing with more liberal points that I made. And this is what I think people, for example, who will watch the Big Daddy Liberty show on Wednesday this week will see, where I then engage a lot of these EFF members. And I mean, you can see it in the moment in real time. A lot of people changing their minds as you bust the myth of the various narratives and points that they hold. So, you know, broadly, the day for me was characterized by misinformation, and it was characterized by a EFF leadership who, maybe to contrast with what Gabriel is saying, I found, you know, they had these sort of whip masters, you know, to continuously keep the anger going, to continuously stoke the bloodlust, if I can call it that, especially when they started seeing that from the ordinary rank and file, there just wasn't an appetite for that. And to give a prime example, just one quick one before I hand it back to you, Hermann, you'll see an incident captured on the show tomorrow where a Christian group rocked up with you know, water, bottled water, some Bibles, and a whole bunch of other goodies to hand out to everybody, the EFF included. And you know, you had this rush of EFF members who were there, having been bussed in, but were not given water. And you know, it was a very hot day on that day, as you guys will remember. And they rushed this Christian little buggy, and they started taking water and handing it out amongst themselves. And two EFF members of parliament, you know, the political elites of that party came out and literally chastised all the EFF members for taking this water from, quote, evil white people. And again, this is all caught on camera, you know, and basically chased away the members and started chastising these two Christian fellows. It was the most stupefying thing to watch. And what I find interesting is that the media I didn't see any mention of this in the mainstream media, even though in that little hubbub, in that little conflict, they were there and they had their cameras on that. So the only time you'll likely see this incident will be on my show on Wednesday. So again, there's a little bit of a moment that I found interesting there, where it was the leaders who were keen on whipping up the racial animus continuously and having to remind ordinary people that, hey, you know, you're here because you're here to fight these evil whites, as they characterize them. You know, the allegation, for example, was, yeah, these whites will bring this water because it's poisoned. I mean, they literally said this in that moment. So again, there was a big gulf, I must reiterate this, between the ordinary people who were there, who were mostly misinformed, as you saw in some of the live footage, you know, that I put out. You know, people saying they were here for racism. What racism? I'm not sure. And you know, the sort of political elites who were using this as a means of essentially more PR for themselves to hit at this voodoo that doesn't exist of you know, the evil white supremacist in this country. But yeah, it was an interesting day.
Yeah, if I can just come back in on that. So I totally agree. To me, it seemed like the leadership's, particularly the EFF's leadership's position, was to try and increase the temperature as far as possible, but then to keep a lid on outright displays of violence against the farmers that could then be used in the media to discredit them. But that said, I mean, the EFF, one of the great ironies, and I think Sihle did such an excellent job of capturing this, is the reasonlessness of so many of those members' arrival in Senekal. But it starts at the top. The EFF said, we've come here to defend state infrastructure.
Yeah.
How did they defend? The only stuff that was broken by EFF supporters. When they broke out of their own zone and went to go and get in the noses of the farmers, they blockaded. I couldn't get out of Senekal at that time, and they'd strewn concrete rubbish bins across the road. That's the only public property that was broken, as well as a sign saying Senekal that was broken by EFF guys. So they weren't there to defend state infrastructure. And in some sense, they were there to break it, and in some sense to occupy it. Of course, I think a lot of people will have seen the footage inside the court of Julius Malema and Biki Cele hanging out and sharing jokes with one another, as well as while Floyd Shivambu is sitting outside the court, sort of standing in the doorway, impossible to get through, looking very glum and hot. And one of the sad things about that is I saw connections of the Horners trying to get into the court, and they weren't able to do so because it was fully occupied by these people who, was Malema inside the court to defend state infrastructure from within the magistrates court? It just doesn't make sense. And that reasonlessness is just captured by, like, what are we here to do? Well, we heard there's some racism and maybe a free T-shirt, so we decided to take the trip. And the final thing about that is the definition of racism. It's so hard to find something racist in a white farm worker being murdered, having caught some stock thieves. You really need a PhD to find racism there. But never forget, the EFF are flashing their academic credentials more than anyone else. They're studying critical race theory straight out of America, very hip, very fashionable at great Ivy League universities. And according to critical race theory, it's racist not to hate white people. It's racist not to discriminate against white people. And this is exactly what Floyd and Malema said. They said Mandela is a racist, Kodesa is racist, Ramaphosa is racist. Anyone who lets white people maintain their property rights is racist. So that's the racism that they came to nominally clash. But but as you say, I don't think that message really translates into meat and potatoes lived reality of the people that get bussed in. So they left sort of waving their hand, saying, I don't actually know why I'm here.
Alex, Sihle's material from Senekal, if you combine YouTube and Facebook, has it's been viewed about 500,000 times, 500,000 views on these videos from, as it were, the ground and so on. Thinking about the news media perspective, you kind of covered a lot of ground that day between Gabriel and Sihle and myself at the various points we were. Where did you pick up the most, as it were, paid media, mainstream media? I don't really like the term, but where did you pick up the clearest presence of these people? And do you think that there was any rhyme or reason in some things being covered and some things not?
Yeah, I don't want to sort of paint the mainstream, as it were, in a sort of they went there with an agenda. The thing that is very apparent is that it's exciting. When the EFF is dancing in the streets, it's like you get caught up in the moment, and there's always a simmering something could happen, and then somebody picks up a box of matches, somebody takes off somebody else's shirt or something like that. And I mean, when Gabriel and I arrived at the court quite early in the morning, there was seven. I think there were about 7 journalists from one news agency there, so they were obviously really equipped. They were ready to shoot stuff. Then you go across to the other side, and you don't see a single cameraman or reporter. And I think it's because there is always that simmering tension, also. So I guess it could be a manufactured tension. But I think what's interesting, having heard what Big Daddy and Gabriel speak to, is sort of how the EFF commands and distract, not just in this case, but the rhetoric generally. So here I'm not even sure what the result of the court case was. I mean, I know a lot of the a few of the major news stations covered Malema's speech, as it were, for however long it was. I think it was half an hour or so. But again, you've got, as Sihle says, you've got these guys being bussed in who, from an urban party who has no real stake in the rural game, and they don't give them water. And I think at one stage the EFF leader said to them, "You will sing to keep yourself entertained. We're not playing music for you." So they're like these are their foot soldiers that are being leveraged. But in the same way, the EFF is commanding the narrative completely, and the media picks it up, and it's feeding into the narrative around the entire discourse around property rights, rural safety, and general security concerns, and trumping it up with racism, which is why the IR's polls and surveys always show, well, land reform, maybe in how it's framed, is always pretty low, but people's main concerns is education and jobs and healthcare and safety and security every time for the past 12 or so years. And I think what is quite sad is how the media sort of latches onto that. But you can see why. In the moment, you can see why that happens. I mean, covering guys praying on their knees is not necessarily the most, if it bleeds, it leads. And I think maybe from your side, Hermann, is to sort of bring back why the IR was there on the ground to present our rural safety charter, is how, taking from what Big Daddy and Gabriel said about they've created this insecurity, because when we arrived the night before and we spoke to some local farmers from Paul Roux, and you got a very sincere sense of tension. And they know where the local patrols are going, they know who's on the ground, their WhatsApp groups are pinging all the time, and it's just at least I think the value of having moderate voices there, us all going there, Big Daddy being there, at least helped. Hopefully we can help to bring the conversation back to the issues that matter, and yeah, hopefully we can do that. And I know some of the tenets of the Rural Safety Charter was sort of giving power back to communities to be responsible for their own safety and security. And I think that's we need to try to see past the smoke and mirrors that the EFF are able to conjure up.
Yeah, I think the EFF is a party uniquely skilled in narrative domination. I think they have the ability to command news media narrative, second perhaps only to Donald Trump. But what I must to touch on the reasons why we were there, why the IRR decided to have a presence there on the day, is the Senekal was really the confluence of a few issues that the Institute has been vocal, a lead voice on in terms of race relations, rule of law, failures of government and policing, and of course property rights and the effect of the rhetoric surrounding property rights on race relations and on the perception of property owners like farmers. Because I think that one thing that we at the Institute have been saying a lot over the last 2 years of EWC, expropriation without compensation, really being a front page issue, is that the land issue is really a convenient entry point because it forms part of this narrative of injustice and this sin of apartheid land grabs that still remain relevant, that still speaks to the deep-seated desires of South Africans to own land. But the reality is that the government have, in cases like David Racha says, or in its recent announcement that it will, make land available to black farmers, it's always about state ownership of land. It's never about black ownership of land. It's never about actual property rights. It's always about the right of the state to own property and the civilian or the citizen, having the goodwill of government to make use of a piece of property allocated to them under certain circumstances and conditions. So when it comes to these four issues, property rights being this obvious touch point where the entire farming community has almost become a scapegoat for why the property rights regime in South Africa needs change, it was very important to show that the matter of property rights, as important as it is not the emotional touch point that the ANC and the EFF wanted to be. And that's why the Nakana Masoka of AFASA, the African Farmers Association of South Africa, speaking at the AfriForum gathering was so powerful in many, many ways. Not only did he make the point that this wasn't about black and white, not only did he make the point that the rule of law needs to be sacrosanct, otherwise, all communities are left vulnerable. Not only did he make the point that policing failures, police often being part of, stock theft syndicates and perhaps other forms of more nefarious criminality, but he made the point that he directly addressed President Ramaphosa and the Minister of Police, saying, leave us alone, leave the farming community alone, and we will provide food for this country. Stop threatening our position within this country. Stop with your property rights, whipping up of division on that. And I just thought that was my takeaway from the entire experience, is that there are moderate voices that can unite around simple solutions, perhaps not easy solutions, but definitely simple ones. And I must say, the speaking to Tiudi Jager of SAI, the South African Agri Initiative, and speaking to Mr. Masoka, it really was, and speaking to them specifically about the IRR's Community Safety Charter, which, as you mentioned, Alex, really aims to put the power of policing decisions and policy back into the hands of communities. I think that it really was such a privilege for me to be part of that conversation and to see that where people have skin in the game, they want solutions. Where they don't have skin in the game, they want media coverage. And 2020 has been a challenging year for the EFF. I mean, what have they really contributed to public debate in this country in 2020? So I think this was political opportunism. But what stood out to me was, I think, that it was a victory for moderate voices, but not just a victory for moderate voices, a victory for moderate voices looking towards collaboration, looking towards solutions. And I must say, it's been annoying ever since to speak to journalists and have radio interviews and news interviews where people say, yes, but what about the race thing? And then our answer is, what about the race thing? Whether you're in Senekal or Soweto or Mitchell's Plain, we might have gang violence in Mitchell's Plain, gender-based violence in Soweto, and farm violence or rural violence in Senekal. They might be different, ripple effects and manifestations of government policing failure and of insecure communities. But just because there are different types of crimes doesn't mean that the common thread isn't government failure. And I think that's exactly the point that was made very, very, very clearly by Mr. Masoka. And a last point before I end this spiel is, I think it's the peak of irony, the height of irony, that competent policing came 3 weeks too late to that community. I think that is a shame, because what we saw on the ground was competent policing, I think. Before we went, Frans Premier, our big boss, said, it seems the plan looks good. The plan to keep the groups out of each other's way looks good. They clearly got someone in who knew what they were doing. And then there's just an intense anger that boils up in me and saying, why 20 days after a young man was killed? Why call on competence? Why be worried about merit 20 days too late for that young man and his family. And that's why I think putting communities central in policing questions really is the heart of this, because I think the reason the police were competent on Friday was because they knew there was an accountability mechanism, whether it is the media to the outside world, whether it is themselves towards the ANC government, or whether it is the police towards the Senekal community. There was a form of accountability. There was a presence of accountability that day that forced competence. And I think South Africans should ask very angrily why that accountability only matters after a life is lost. So perhaps to conclude our time here together, Gabriel, what comes next in this issue? Perhaps you can tell us what comes next in the Senekal legal matter, but also in terms of the battle of ideas. I think this was a small victory for moderate voices and for good ideas. And I'm going to take this to all three of you. What's the next step to make solutions a reality in this country?
So in terms of the trial, it's very frustrating. Evidence Rapport got hold of a dossier over a week ago with ID numbers, case numbers, vehicle registration numbers, invocable witnesses, and evidence showing that there is a stock theft cartel. They have evidence of 1,500 cattle that were stolen in the winter of last year alone. 300 of those returned. So that's 1,200 stock units stolen. You can easily value that at 12 million rand. I was speaking to a local. I said, why would anyone steal stock when they could steal cars? And he said, because you make more money stealing stock. So this dossier not only implicates, well, I'll just say vaguely, it implicates important police officers in that area. And Rapport reached out to SAPS, to the Hawks, for comment on whether they would even acknowledge receiving the dossier, and they didn't. I independently, through speaking to one of the private investigators, also found confirmation of this prima facie evidence of police involvement in the stock theft unit, which would explain why the murder was so violent to some extent. If you're not just worried about getting caught, you're also worried that if you get caught and you go to jail, your ally in the syndicate is a police officer who's in charge. You might go missing. And one of the key bits of evidence is of someone who caught stock thieves going to jail on a separate charge and then dying in jail. And let's not forget, like, first 6 weeks of lockdown, 50 people died in police custody as a result of police action in just a few weeks. And that is worse than normal, but it's not that much worse than normal. 4,000 allegations taken to IPID last year of police torture and several of hundreds of rape. So, a lot of people don't always trust the police. And that terrorized sense of the community, I think, also speaks to why there's such a huge disconnect between common people's values and those who call the shots. But it's on Sunday or Saturday, carte blanche, Derek Watt spoke to Becky Cele, and Cele said that they are looking into this. I've been on the phone all morning with police representatives trying to confirm that they are using the dossier of information, or that they'll acknowledge its existence. Haven't managed to be able to get confirmation on that. But what's key here is it's been a long time since the 1st of October, and a long time even since the two suspects were apprehended. It's been over a week and a half. And I think it would be extremely worrying if there are the only two people arrested, because if you grab the henchmen, stock thieves just do not standardly go out and steal cars and then wonder what you're going to do with it. There's usually a place that you plan to take it to, and a reason that you believe you're not going to be traced over there by the cops or by other interested parties. So if only the henchmen get taken, but the higher ups are left to do as they please, then I don't think that the Senekal and Paul Roux community are going to have a lot of real reason to think that they're any safer than they were. So yeah, I agree with you. Good performance on Friday, but that's the big go forward in terms of this case. And in terms of the broader step forward, I mean, there's several. I think you can't just say one, but one that's very important is to identify this simple idea that property is theft. This is the simple idea that's being sold by the EFF. It's also the simple idea being sold by Parliament and by the President. When you say the issue with South Africa that we...
Sorry, Gabriel, you were busy saying that the central idea, if property is theft.
Yeah, this idea, it's just the idea, it's just a different way of living. Some people think that if someone else has money, it's because they've somehow stolen it. They think if you're a middleman, you buy for 10, you sell for 12, that profit you're making is somehow stealing from someone else. If you've got a farm that you've bought using a bank, somehow that's because of white monopoly capital, that makes you a thief. This idea that to have something is always an exercise in force, that everyone who actually has something has managed to force their way into it, is the underlying principle behind expropriation without compensation, and the underlying principle behind the EFF's line that we've come here to fight and die for the land. And that idea, it legitimizes corruption. It legitimizes crime. It says that if Frieda Dairy, if it turns out that guys stole hundreds of millions of rands to pay for a wedding instead of actually doing rural upliftment of black farmers, well played to you. It says that if there's a police commander who's getting a salary, one of the things report noted was that there are police commanders who have been witnessed saying, we don't even have to touch our salaries. That's pure savings because of all of the money that we make through stock theft. Now, there's a mentality, and you can see it on The Sopranos. If you watch that, you can see it if you read about the American mafia under Prohibition in the 20s and 30s. There's a mentality where people think, well, property is theft, so if you're rich, that just means you're a really good thief. And that idea is pernicious. It's pernicious because a small group believes it, but they're a violent group, and they've got their hands on the levers of state power, and they're increasingly clutching for disorganized, mob-like vigilante violence too. And we saw it in the People's War, and I'm afraid we might see it again today if we don't continue to have minor victories like we did. But it's not enough to win the day. We have to win the minds. We have to explain to people, why did we win? And the reason why we won, in my opinion, is because the people on the ground that kept the peace turned their backs on that idea that might is right. And turn their faces towards one another and said the only way that you can really sustainably enjoy freedom and prosperity is by voluntary, social, value-add-based interaction. And so we kept the peace, but people have to understand the reason we kept the peace is because the property is theft guys were put down, and the property is something that you build guys got a chance to have their voices heard, and that has to grow.
Sife, I think you have some very personal experience with how important property rights can be, the fight for property rights, the fight to use land, to use property, to further your community. Is Gabriel right? Is this where the heart of the matter lies?
Absolutely. Look, I think you've got to give people a stake in the society they live in, which is why I talk a lot about the idea that the ideal South African society is a free, prosperous, property-owning and non-racial one. That property-owning ambit I mentioned on purpose, because if you look at the nature of our history and the exclusion of some people based on either race or any other arbitrary facets of who they are, has always been the denial of property rights of those individuals. And you still have millions of South Africans today, the vast majority of whom are black and live on rural plots of land, who are denied property rights, even though they live on, when it comes to land, for example, quite substantial plots of land. Some even calling those particular parts of wherever they live home for generations. For my family, for instance, we can track back where we stay on the paternal side for 7 generations at least. So there's a massive conversation in terms of us changing the climate of opinion in South Africa on the issue of property, to basically saying, give ordinary people the opportunity, the freedom, the liberty to own their piece of Africa, to say, this is my home. And, you know, we talk a lot about the individual as classical liberals, but really we're a family society. And insofar as ownership occurs in South Africa and property rights occur in South Africa, yes, the individual, but also families being able to say, this is ours. We can fence it off. We can generate wealth and income and develop it because we know it's safely within the Ngobese clan, the Pretorius folk, or whatever the case may be. So I think that's the mission. If there's a takeaway from me, from Senekal, it's being part of those voices, ever increasingly loud, moderate voices that advocate for these sort of ideas, even with the sort of people that we consider, you know, lost to ideology, you know, leftist or otherwise. So that'll be my takeaway, a continued fight, if you will, from the likes of us at the Institute of Race Relations, the Big Daddy Liberty Show, and so forth, for these ideas that create that prosperous, property owning, free and non-racial society.
Alex, anything that you want to take away, specifically looking ahead, looking to 2021, looking at some of the stories that we want to tell about real South Africans and how policy affects them? If you could have one takeaway from Senekal and about the reality that policy isn't something that happens far away in Parliament, it's something that happens on the streets of your community, what do you think should be done in those streets where I think the real debate, the discussion, progress of policy and better ideas can really happen?
Sure, it's actually a really tough question, because I think the one takeaway for me, and I think to quote Big Daddy himself, is don't be dribbled. I think we should all get T-shirts in 2021. Is don't be dribbled, because what stands, even though you've got the EFF bringing in like you've got urban people into rural areas, they don't know what's going on, and I think the thing is politicians generally, but the powers that be in Mzansi don't care about the people in reality. And, you know, in the same time that we go down to Senekal, you've got Mpumalanga farmers being shifted off their land for not paying bribes. You've got an expropriation bill being pushed through. You know, there's, you know, you've got complicit policing, but where there's a will, there's a way. And I think looking to 2021, you know, I think there's a big challenge in trying to, you know, in telling these stories on the ground, to show and not just tell. And because this is how policy really does affect communities on the ground and undermine society. And I think there's been, we've had substantive years of South Africans' dignity being hammered. And we're going into an election year next year. And I think that's something to keep an eye out. And I think, you know, I think a big challenge will be in telling these stories. So I think we've got a lot on our plate. But I think, yeah, it's just to find the voices that you believe in. And yeah, I think perspective is always useful. So I think we've got our plates full. So it should be an interesting year in 2021. So hopefully we'll do some interesting stuff.
I love the idea of don't be dribbled, because that really plays into my takeaway from these events. Is South Africa is a country that for at least 100 years now has outsourced problem solving to the state. We even did that, I think, in the immediate decade after 1994. We outsourced racial reconciliation to Mandela, and he happened to be good at it, so it went well. But I think that's something that does need to change. Is it's no longer good enough to say someone must do something. There is this famous quote of JFK is, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And don't make the mistake of thinking that country is the union buildings over there or a parliament. No, the country that you can do something for is the people you face every day, the community you function within. So it's time for, I think, the people to lead and government to follow. That is the role that I think that's the positive that can come out of Senekal, is it was a day that showed moderate voices to be more powerful than agitators, and that if we can convince those moderate voices that they don't just need to do problem solving on days charged with tension, but on every other day of the year, then I think there's a lot of hope and a lot of prosperity for this country. But it's not going to fall into our laps. Don't be dribbled. Never trust a commie. Tell the truth in no uncertain terms, and make sure that the battle of ideas isn't something that passes you by. Get informed, get involved, and I think we will have many, many more Senekals that we can look at and say, the moderate voices won, solutions won, and I hope we can meet on that battlefield, because I think we can turn it into a field, not of battle, but of growth and unity. Thank you, everyone.